Hi, we finally come to the end of the longest chapter in the book of Genesis as Isaac finally meets Rebekah. And as we've been seeing throughout this chapter, Rebekah has been an active agent ever since she went down to the well and offered to water the 10 camels until they were done drinking. And Isaac we've hardly met. Isaac we saw going along with his father in chapter 22 for the binding, simply speaking, where is the ram for the offering, my father? And that's all we know about him. So we know only by implication that he and his father and mother were living apart during the time period that's at issue here. We hear that Isaac, as we see in verse 62, had come from Bir Lahai Roy here and was settled in the Negev, which simply means south. So somewhere south of here, whereas his mother, as we saw, had been living up here in the Hebron, Mamre area, but now is buried in the field of, or in the cave of Machpelah in the Hittite town. And so when we find out at the end that he's taking Rebekah, his new woman, into his mother Sarah's tent, we have to wonder, where is this scene taking place? Because as we look up in the beginning here, all we hear is he was settled in the Negev, which is like saying somebody in the United States is in the South. It could be all kinds of places. It certainly doesn't appear to be the place that the servant left from, which is Beersheba, which is where Abraham was. So if the servant knows where Isaac is, which he certainly does know, he's not finding that out now. What it implies is that Abraham knew where Isaac was as well, but simply didn't go to visit him. Or maybe Isaac didn't want to visit him. How Abraham knows where his alienated son is, we don't know. But they've been apart for many years. We know it's now been 3 years since Sarah died, and it's been over 20 years since the binding story. So they've been apart from each other all this time. So Isaac has no particular reason to expect that a wife is going to be given to him, and we have no idea what he's doing with his life. We find out in chapter 25 that he's now 40 years old when he marries Rebekah. So what's this 40-year-old man been doing ever since he was a teenager and his father took up to the mountain and almost killed him? We have no idea whatsoever. So Isaac is a blank slate as we enter into this passage, as we see. The text follows us from his perspective throughout here, so we begin to hear it from this, although we'll also hear it from Rebekah's perspective. Isaac went out in the evening to walk in the field. Matching what we saw in the beginning of the chapter when the servant went down to the well, when women go out to get their water. It also matches, but with a different word, what we heard with Yahweh walking in the evening breeze in the garden, but again, it's a different word there, so it doesn't evoke that directly. To walk in the field, and the Midrash and other commentators have wondered a lot about what this word lasoach can mean. Options include to think, to pray, to take a stroll, which Westerman, for no apparent reason, thinks is most likely. But Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg suggests to meditate, but of course we don't know. And as Zornberg continues to say, here it contrasts with the world of chesed, or that covenant faithfulness or loyalty that we saw in the last scenes, that makes up Rebekah's world, a function of life after the Akedah. So Isaac is not in the world of chesed, he's in the world of isolation. And looking up, he saw camels coming. Literally, he lifted up his eyes and saw, matched immediately by her, which brings up how that figure of speech has been used throughout Genesis, and so we see it from the beginning when Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the plain of the Jordan. There it was a negative thing, in contrast to Abraham listening to the voice of Yahweh, so he is judging the land in his own eyes. But in other situations, it's not so much a matter of judgment as his awareness. So Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the 3 men standing there in chapter 18. In the third day, on the way to Moriah, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place far away. Later in that same scene, he lifted his eyes and saw the ram. Here we have our current scene where Isaac lifted his eyes and sees, and she lifted her eyes and sees. I didn't translate it directly there, but it's the same phrase in each one of them. Then we'll see Jacob lifting his eyes and terrifyingly see Esau coming with 400 men. But in the same, with a parallel with ours, where both of them lift their eyes and see, Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children. What a contrast what they see, but we'll get there when we get there in chapter 33. And then finally, Joseph lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. And that's what leads him to cry and to reveal himself to his brothers. So the lifting up and seeing is something we're going to see throughout. As we also look at our last scene, we note at the very beginning of this chapter, we saw that in the key words, land was used 6 times here and Isaac only once. And now in the final scene it's reversed, where Isaac is mentioned 6 times and land only once. It's plainly about the union of these two people together. It's no longer about the question of implicitly the exilic audience or post-exilic audience figuring out how to get out of Babylon. So he's walking the field, he looks up and sees the camels coming, doesn't see the people. doesn't see the riders on camels, as you can see in this picture here, or the men who are of his father, which he knows nothing about. He just sees the camels. When Rebekah looks up, suddenly the camera switches to her perspective. When she saw Isaac, the NRSV is polite here and says she slipped, but literally she fell. The Septuagint, also perhaps embarrassed about the fell, says sprung, suggesting she's moving quickly. But the original is that she fell, which is to say there's something shocking about this. But she doesn't know who it is. The text says she saw Isaac as if it's her perspective and she knows it's Isaac. But we see immediately after, as she said to the servant, "Who is the man over there walking in the field to meet us?" We don't know how far apart they are. It just says looking up he sees camels coming. It doesn't say they're far in the distance, so we don't really have a sense of how far it is. Notice that she says to the servant here, who's throughout been the man, and now she says the man about Isaac. And so apparently she's not already expecting that to be the one, or we don't know how far the journey is. Again, on the map, we don't know exactly where they're going in the Negev, and presumably she's never been in this entire territory before, so she has no reason to think at this moment that she's seeing the man. And again, to emphasize the fact we don't know how they got there, of how they knew where to go, but the text isn't concerned about that. The servant said, "It is my master." And up till now, we've known his master was Abraham. We saw throughout he referred to the son of his master. And so it's suggesting that the absent Abraham has died. But first of all, the servant would have no knowledge of that. He's not been home in all this time. And in fact, Abraham hasn't died, as we'll find out. The very next scene is about him finding another woman and having a bunch more children. So he shifted his allegiance now from the older generation to the younger, and although we won't see him again. So now she takes her veil and covers herself. And various interpretations of this. Sarna, taking it in the cultural context, noting that Tamar will do that in chapter 38, but he notes it's not the normal practice for Israelite women, perhaps initiating the marriage ritual. As we'll see in the next generation, this practice of covering yourself with a veil before you go in to meet your husband will be the key to the trickery that Laban uses over Jacob via the veiled Leah, but of course he's not here for this scene. And then finally Perry adds, upon hearing the servant's answer, she suddenly realizes to her shame that she's been riding on the camel immodestly exposed, intimately free with a stranger who is not her fiancé. Thus she hurriedly takes her veil and covers herself. Still under Perry's sense that she's been thinking all along that she was coming back to marry the servant, not the servant's master's son. But again, as we saw earlier in the chapter here, he'd already said plainly that he was making the way successful to let the woman be the one for his master's son, and he repeated that to the family, as we can see here, right here. So really shouldn't be the case that she doesn't know at this point. And covered herself, noting the contrast here with chapter 29, the second type scene at the well where Jacob will uncover the well there. So she covers herself when she meets Isaac, and when Jacob's about to meet his wife Rachel, he uncovers the well. And so now the servant, interestingly, told Isaac all the things he had done, but just in this simple one-verse summary. After all the retellings that we saw of his encounter with Abraham at the beginning and his encounter with Rebekah at the well, and telling that in great detail, we don't need to hear the rhetorical way in which he tells us. But it would be interesting to hear, wouldn't it? Because Isaac, as far as we know, has no idea this is even happening. Westermann notes below, this gives rise to an oral narrative which, as an account rendered of a commission, has an important function in the community. Every oral repetition is a new variant, the consequence of which is that at the beginning Rebekah will tell the story a little differently from the servant. But we don't hear either of those versions told here. So the servant, we're told Isaac all the things, and given his trickiness, we have to just wonder how he presented this. And so we reach our final verse with a very interesting little twist in the story. And as Miguel de la Torre notes below, the reader is left wondering if Isaac obtained a wife or a replacement with benefits for his mother. Rebekah becomes the wife-mother, expected to continue doting and spoiling what appears to be a man-child. Let's look at the verse and see what he's basing that on. So Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. Several things we have to pay attention to here. Westermann takes a seemingly nonsensical statement as an addition and suggests it can't mean what it says. It could refer first to Isaac's tent and then to Abraham's death. But that's doing what source-oriented people do, is saying, I can't make sense of this text, so I'll make it mean something other than what it actually says. So we're not going to settle for that. My note below farther says this ignores the emotional distance that must have lingered between the father and son after the Akedah. After all, it's been over 20 years. If we imagine Abraham is dead, the absence of notice of Isaac's mourning for him underscores the price paid for obedience by Abraham. But we'll find out that when Abraham does die, Isaac and Ishmael will come to bury him in the cave of Machpelah. So a lot of facts not presented here. How they know about the cave, how they know he's died, how they know where each other are never told. But the mother Sarah's tent, apart from the fact that a woman's tent is a vaginal symbol, and this suggesting a bizarre element of incest here, why would her tent still exist? She's dead and buried here. We've seen tents a number of times, and an interesting element, I didn't make a chart of tents, but let's just go back and look at a couple of things so we see a contrast. In 12:8, we heard Abraham moved on the hill country to the east of Bethel and pitched his tent. Notice his tent. We see similarly in chapter 13 here, he journeyed on by stages from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning. And so it's his tent, not their tent. And we can assume at one level that's a patriarchal description of their tent, simply described as his tent, as in the phrase Bet Ab, the father's house. But this isn't the father's house, this is the specific of the tent. And what those previous references to Abraham's tent suggest is perhaps they had separate tents. Perhaps the women have their own tents and the men have their tents. And certainly that would make sense out of what we'll see in chapter 34 in the fictional version of where Dinah is before she's raped, which is the menstrual tent described as the red tent, where women would go to comfort each other and support each other during their periods. But that's not what's at issue here. This is simply the issue of his mother's tent. So do we imagine that this is metaphorical, that his own tent is symbolically his mother's tent? Why would her tent still exist, and why would he have it? Is it just kept as a souvenir? Is he living in his mother's tent? We don't know that, but it doesn't certainly suggest he's having to set it up. It suggests that somehow, despite the fact that he wasn't at the burial of his mother, that he went back there somehow and got this tent and brought it back to the Negev with him. What other explanation can there be? You can decide for yourself. So he took Rebekah, and she became his woman, and he loved her. And this is the first time we're hearing of that, and we've seen love in Genesis only one time for father-son love, when we were told to Abraham was told, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. And so we never heard that Isaac loved his father or his mother. We simply hear that he loves Rebekah. We'll later hear that he loves his son Esau because he's fond of game, and we'll hear that. So he has the same feeling for Esau and for food that he has for his wife. That doesn't tell us a lot about Isaac's relationship with Rebekah, and then we'll see the others down here. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Using the word Nachem for comfort, much like Noah after the flood. And the next use will be ironic, where we'll hear that Esau is comforting himself, planning to kill his brother Jacob. So he's been mourning his mother's death for 3 years without comfort, and now he has her. But the story will oddly not focus on Isaac, but will disappear back into Abraham and into Ishmael. And Isaac will really not be part of the story, other than with one scene in chapter 26. So we'll turn to a new story in chapter 25 next time. See you then.